Hi class. All right, now we're looking at chapter 14, social behavior. It's an interesting chapter. Again, it's kind of lends its way from personality, the chapter we just talked about, to seeing things more in a global perspective. And so I always start my class out by asking one of the students, how is your behavior different here in the classroom than at home? How come you're sitting in your chair instead of just laying out on the desk? And so we talk about that for a little bit, and then lo and behold, what we come to the conclusion is that we change our behavior based off of the behavior of those people that are around us, our interactions with them. So social psychology is a study of how living among others influences our thought, feelings, and behavior. So evolutionary psychologists theorize that groups live together for several advantages: safety, completion of cooperative tasks. And because of that, from an evolutionary perspective, that's why we preserve group membership, which is kind of interesting when we look at the whole perspective of things. So let's take a look at some activities that occur in a social settings that are changed based off of that. One is their social facilitation. This is Norman Triplett did some research in this area. Social facilitation is the presence of others improves one's performance. And so for an example, he did a study where children were throwing out, little, maybe they had plastic fishing rods, and their job was to roll it in as fast as they could. And so he would do that with them individually. Then when he put two kids together, he found that they were both much faster when there was somebody else with us. So that's social facilitation. Then unfortunately, there's social loafing. And if you've ever been in a group, had a group project in class, there's always that one person who's just not going to put in as much effort as everybody else. And so that is usually due to what they call diffusion of responsibility. And so one way of solving that is making sure we assign tasks to each person and holding them responsible for completing that task. Conformity is another component of this particular chapter. There are social norms, rules about what's acceptable or not acceptable for example, men crying, that type thing in public. Conformity occurs when people adjust their behavior to what others are doing. Example, weird behavior in a classroom. We do that, we change our behavior because of a couple of things. First, there's information social influence. That is that people conform to others because they believe they're a source of knowledge. I know for me, when I went into our high school, it was a very competitive high school. Well, I had to change the way I dressed, change the way I looked, because those guys that were doing really well in high school are not going to help me to be successful unless I kind of fit in with them. So that's one reason why we do it. Another is normative social influence, and we just go along with peer pressure. And if you don't think peer pressure affects you, look at the video clip on Salt by Solomon and Ash, where Philip Lombardo kind of explains what's going on here, and you'll see that we're more likely to succumb to pressure, even though it's obvious that we shouldn't, and it's right in front of us. Then there is groupthink. When the group takes over the thought process, there may be some naysayers, but their opinion is squelched because of the group. And what we often say when we have a problem, we should get our group together. Not always the best results come from that. For example, the text talks about our invasion into Iraq. No weapons of mass destruction there. Another example, because that may be a little bit controversial, is I believe it was, I forget the name of it. It was a shuttle that was going up into space. It was the last one. Not the last one. It was in Florida. There was a teacher on there, and there was one person who was saying that the shuttle should not go, but the group thing took over, and it exploded over the Atlantic Ocean. There's also minority social influence with 12 Angry Men. If you've never seen that film, I encourage you to do that. It shows how a minority can change the opinion of others by being consistent and unwavering. That's the key thing. Obedience, another component of social psychology. We're likely to conform when a person yields to the will. That's the definition. Yields the will to another. Milgram's experiment is his experiment with shocking individuals gives some insight into that. It's kind of horrific experiment, by the way. Social perception is the way we make sense of our world, and we do that through attributions. Attributions are kind of like heuristics. They're shortcuts. They're shortcuts to deciding, making decisions about the people around us. Now, there are two types of attributions. There's dispositional attributions, and this is where people's behavior, they ascribe people's behavior to something within them, like their personality, motive, or attitudes. And then there's situational attribution, and that's where they think something outside the person, such as their the situation that they're in, something outside them is causing a certain behavior. Maybe their nature, the nature of them is causing it. And what we see is that there's a self-serving bias. There's two ones. There's a self-serving bias and then the fundamental attribution error. So the self-serving bias says that we use situation attributions for ourselves, for our failures, like it wasn't my fault that I failed that class, it was the teacher's fault. But dispositional attributions for our successes, yes, I am a genius, that's why I did well in this class. And we use what they call the fundamental attribution error, explains other people's behavior in terms of dispositional attributions, like there's something wrong with that person, that's why they didn't do well. That can also reflect cultural tendencies as well. Then the text goes on and looks at detecting deception. Are you a good lie detector? It discusses stereotypes, which are schemas of how people behave based simply on groups to which they belong. That's a discussion that's quite interactive in class. And then we talk about the role of exclusion and inclusion. And if you remember, several chapters ago we talked about pain, emotional pain, that an individual feels when they've had a breakup or they're being disregarded by other people in their social class that they want to be a part of. Well, what happens is we have exclusion and inclusion. And so I have this exercise with my students. I'll have an imaginary electronic ball, and I'll have three students we're throwing the ball back and forth. And then one of the students I exclude. I just throw it to one person back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then we ask that person I excluded, how did you feel? I felt like I got left out. And again, you remember I talked about that pain, that emotional pain that you might feel when you break up, and it's actually a different part of the brain that's being lit up. It's kind of similar to the place where you would have physical pain. That's what's happening with exclusion and inclusion. And of course, many times what causes that according to the text, we say what causes that is competing for limited resources. The emotional effects, or is that pain that I just talked about. So we discussed prejudice and discrimination in the class, racism. Let me just define prejudice. So prejudice is a biased attitude towards a group of people or an individual member of a group based on unfair generalizations about what members of that group are like. Racism is prejudice based on race and ethnicity, and discrimination is a preferential treatment of certain people, usually driven by prejudicial attitudes. Excuse me, guys. I got a sip of water here. And so if you don't think you're prejudiced, there are some sites there that can verify whether or not you have any prejudiced attitudes, and you'll be surprised. Even though you don't think you are, probably going to be some biases that we all hold. Discuss attitude. Attitude is a person's favorable, unfavorable feeling, belief, or action towards an object, idea. Some are, we look at nature and nurture. Some are ingrained, like we've got universal fear of snakes, revulsion of bodily waste. Those are kind of nature type things. Mere exposure increases our overall preference for things. And we talked about attitude change, a term called cognitive dissonance. So that's a feeling of discomfort caused by information that is at odds with one's conception of oneself as a reasonable and sensible person. And so I use smoking as an example. Somebody might think they're reasonable and they're, pretty sharp, but what occurs when they're exposed to the fact that there's 21 known carcinogens in a cigarette can influence their behavior. And that's when they feel that discomfort. That's what they call cognitive dissonance. Persuasion is the act of attempting to change opinions, beliefs, choices of others by explanation or argument, and it depends on three things: the source, who's talking to you, the method they use to convey. Unfortunately, we usually use fear, like 21 known carcinogens, and the audience, which is an undecided group. That's why you'll see like politicians, they're not really focusing on one side, like Democrats or Republicans. They're focusing on the undecided. Those are the ones that they want to pull into their camp. Text then looks at social relations, aggression, helping, and attraction. There's different types of aggression. There's hostile aggression, stems from feelings of anger, and then there's instrumental aggression, like we see on the football field or any boxing or wrestling. Aggression to achieve a goal. Genetics can play a factor with this. Genetic disposition, head injuries, levels of hormones, testosterone and serotonin can be a factor. In fact, when I work with individuals with antisocial personality disorder, you'll find many of them, when they're being treated, are given an antidepressant, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm not depressed." Well, what happens? We find that people with hostile, aggressive behavior, that they have low levels of serotonin, and so prescribing an antidepressant helps in that area. And then there is nurture, and that's just a frustration achieving goals, threats to our safety, observational social learning theory we talked about with Albert Bandura a few chapters ago. Then the text looks at pro-social behavior, benefits others, altruism, empathy. And it brings up the bystander effect, which is interesting. So I always ask my students, where do you think the safest place to be is if you're in danger, being attacked? Is it in Holbrook, or is it in St. John's, or is it in Phoenix where there's people around you? What the research shows is that you're going to be safer in small communities than Phoenix, even though there's people around you. And that's because of the bystander effect. People are going to see what other people are doing. If somebody else walks past you, they're going to walk past you too. When one person helps you, then a lot of people are going to help you. In smaller communities, it's like, I know you, I know your neighbor, and so they're more likely to help. And that again is an example of this diffusion of responsibility that we talked about earlier with social loafing. Other factors that can affect whether or not somebody helps is just in a hurry, ambiguous situation, like if a couple's fighting, try to get involved. There's a cost-benefit analysis. Is it dangerous for me? Those things are factors there. Let's see. Liking, attraction, and love. Do opposites attract? Well, we find in fact that we're more likely to be attracted to somebody who's more like us than not. Even though we talk about opposites attracting, what happens is that they might attract, but when we find out that they're not really as compatible as we like. For example, say a woman meets the love of her life. I use this in my class as an example. And they exchange numbers, and she thinks, "Oh, great, my heart is throbbing." And she is a tree hugger. So she's a key environmentalist, wants to save the forest, and the guy that she's attracted to is a logger. Probably not going to be a good relationship. And so that's why we see that opposites don't attract. Even in physical attractiveness, while we might want to be with somebody who's really, really attractive, we're more likely to marry or to have relationships with people that are similar to us in attractiveness. Sexual attraction and mate selection. Men and women have different approaches because of parental investment theory is a key factor there. Parental investment theory states that women have more to lose in having a sexual relationship with someone because of pregnancy. And so that's how the theory goes, is that changes how males desire sexual partners and females desire sexual partners. Most of the research says that most males would say that they would like to have 18 partners in their lifetime, and females 4 to 5. And then it ends with love, Sternberg's triarchic theory of love, which is kind of a nice theory. Let me just go over there real quick. It's over on page. I'm just going to find it real quick here. Let's see where we're at. over on page 560. So he says there's three components. There's passion, which is like the physical component of a relationship. There's intimacy, which is that deep emotional component to it. And there's commitment. And that's the third part. And that's where I'm going to stay with you no matter what, through thick and thin. Thick and thin. So they're committed to that person regardless of what's going on. And what he says is that when you've got all three things going, you've got what they call consummate love. Now, most relationships are going to have two things going, not necessarily three. And so some relationships can work well, like if we've got passion and commitment, or excuse me, sorry about that. If we have commitment and intimacy, that's going to be a relationship that's going to last. Because we can increase passion. Usually that's like a long-lasting relationship, marriages that last 20 years or so. Those are something that can occur. When we've got passion and commitment, that's kind of like a stalker. And when we have passion and intimacy without commitment, that's kind of like a fling. And so with that said, guys, that finishes up chapter 14. Hope that you enjoy it. And we will go on to the next chapter. Thank you so much for your patience, guys.